International migration has been rising over time in response to global economic and political integration. Migration has an age dimension. Growing numbers of youths are involved in international migration. Everywhere, youths migrate for various reasons. They are, of course, not a homogeneous group. They represent a diversity of socio-economic backgrounds and experiences. Some move in the quest for better education and certification, others for higher wages and income earnings. Some too are forced to move for better living conditions and a quality of life that the current infrastructure in their home country fails to provide or provide sufficiently. All Europe is affected by migration. Youth migrants, as arguably the most mobile of social groups, stand at the forefront of this development. Evidently, the face of Europe is changing, and youth migrants play an important role in determining its future. Where youth migration to Europe is concerned, Sweden presents an interesting case study. As with many other Western European countries, Sweden has experienced a growing immigrant population. Yet in contrast with the trend towards more restrictive legislation, Sweden has continued to pursue a rather liberal policy based on the principles of diversity, multiculturalism, and egalitarian values. Thus, for many eager and aspiring youth migrants, Sweden represents the promised land. We tell the stories of these youth migrants. They all came with a dream. Within this dream, they yearn for a better life. The recent riots in some suburbs of Sweden lay bare the picture of vulnerability that these youth migrants in Sweden find themselves in. Discrimination, the difficulties of integration, and media misrepresentations are just some of the multiple post-migration challenges and barriers that youth migrants have to face. Oftentimes, the youth migrant body occupies a liminal space, a space of in-betweenness, neither belonging here nor there. Their identity as the other invites prejudices and discriminatory practices by indigenous people.
Are in a minority in this country, in a country where Islam is constantly in the spotlight often for all the wrong reasons. There's all sorts of Islamophobia going on at a local level in schools in the form of bullying. There's a real challenge for Muslim youth to resolve the identity crisis that a lot of them suffer from.
Attending disco dances, dressing in Western style, and challenging patriarchal values are part of the strategy some youth migrant bodies adopt to fit in as the other. However, these performative aspects show how youth migrants are forced to negotiate their primary identity against an adopted Western youth culture.
This young woman moved to Sweden from Iran a decade ago. The new life meant a new school and new friends. But her family, steeped in tradition, did not agree with her new lifestyle.
When my father learnt that I had Swedish friends, he told me not to spend time with them. I refused. Then he and my brothers started beating me severely.
Traversing a new social world in the capacity of the other potentially impacts the identity formation of these youths. Especially at such a pivotal transitional stage into adulthood, cross-border impacts are far greater for youths than for adults whose identities have been more firmly developed.
Mobility means different things for different youths living in different places. It is often taken for granted that youths are the most mobile. This is, however, hardly the case for youth migrants in Sweden. We consider their spatial immobility within Swedish urban space as an indispensable part of their everyday challenge. Linguistic barriers have been documented to be a major hurdle for youth migrants in general.
I can talk Swedish perfectly, so the teachers learned me how to speak. But the first year, I didn't talk anything. I was quiet.
Specifically, incompetency in the Swedish language can discourage youth migrants from navigating, or at least comfortably navigating, most educational and economic spaces. For obvious reasons, financial barriers can also limit the spatial mobility of youth migrants. This is Husby, a suburb of Stockholm, one of the many migrant enclaves in Sweden.
Built in the 60s and 70s to provide inexpensive housing. In the beginning, it was poorer Swedes who moved into these areas, but after a while, more and more immigrants began to arrive. The Swedes moved away and the immigrants stayed.
Sweden's rough working-class migrant enclaves serve not only as a reminder of youth migrants' spatial immobility, but they also clearly define an imagined spatial boundary within which these migrants may claim smooth access to. However, in doing so, they deny access to those who don't deem fit. working-class neighborhoods, and telling a local and collective identity that provided feelings of security and self-esteem have been converted into poor suburbs, marked by socio-economic instability and uncertainty, and deprived of any positive values. In these isolated neighborhoods, youth migrants find themselves locked into an unforgiving cycle of spatial segregation. One of the greatest challenges that youth migrants in Sweden face is structural discrimination. Many of them are burdened by chronic joblessness and limited educational opportunity. In Sweden, the unemployment rate of youth migrants was almost 39% in 2011, much higher than that of native youth and foreign-born adults.
I was sitting around at home for almost a whole year, looking for work. Everyone said, "You're too young, you're unskilled, you haven't got this and you haven't got that."
Compared to their native Swedish peers, youth migrants on average have weaker educational outcomes. The toughest challenges appear to be access to national programs and completion in secondary education.
Take the school, for instance. Almost half the primary schoolers here in Husby don't make it into the upper secondary school. The grade point averages are among the worst in Sweden. In any other community, the local politicians would make sure that changes quickly. But here, they don't care.
Among Sweden's youth migrants, frustrations are high. For so long, they find themselves victimized by a system of institutional racism, paralyzed by a structure of pervasive and disenfranchising discrimination. Instead, in media representations, we see the othering of youth migrants in Sweden being further reinforced.
You get welfare, you get access to the education system up to university level, you get access to public transport, to libraries, to healthcare, to everything, and still they feel that they need to riot, throw stones and Molotov cocktails. It's ridiculous.
Sweden could be paying a tough price for its policies on immigrants and multiculturalism. A Stockholm suburb erupted into violence for a few hours as crowds of angry, masked youths from migrant families burned cars, smashed windows, and hurled stones at police officers.
It tests the Swedish society. What they say to the police when the police comes is, "This is not your area, go away, we make the rules out here."
Their sensationalization of the riots, for example, creates an enduring image of youth migrants as problematic, deviant, and criminal. Such stereotypical representations can generate stress and anxiety for these young people as they negotiate their everyday life worth.
Structural discrimination and misrepresentations faced in the new country perpetuate young migrants' lack of socio-economic opportunities. This forces them into social dependence, further reinscribing the negative stereotype of them as leeching on Sweden's welfare system. Early educational and financial barriers leave these young migrants systematically excluded from employment and social-political opportunities, and even their access to certain spaces. These realities have real spatial-temporal effects on youth migrants as it reduces their socio-economic advancements later in their life course. The migrant youth body is a site of social-spatial relations, representations, and intersecting identities, where cultural friction create multiple scales of exclusion to reproduce their marginalized positions in society. Drawn by attractive and welcoming immigration policies to a country which prides itself on a generous welfare system and liberal social attitudes, youths migrate to Sweden for what they perceive to be a brighter future. Yet, their dreams often do not match up to post-migration realities. Everyday challenges and socio-economic vulnerability defeats the purpose for which they have come in the first place. It further adds on to the challenges youth face while transiting from youthhood to adulthood. Perhaps, these post-migration challenges seem to pale in comparison to political unrest and diminished prospects back home, but it is equally daunting as these young migrants have to cope with their lives in environments that offer insufficient support for them to feel that their future is secure.